So, in today's lesson, we are looking at why did exploration increase under Elizabeth's reign? We're going to try to understand different reasons for this increase in exploration, and as well as that, we're going to look at one case study, the circumnavigation of the globe by Sir Francis Drake, and the impact that this had. Now, I'm not going to set any questions for this lesson, but I'm going to give you some exam questions you might want to practice on, and we're going to work through one of those together for 12 marks. And also, I would really recommend that you make notes and you make flashcards to make sure that this knowledge stays with you in preparation for the exam. As always, guys, any questions you might have, gbrown@stopsleyhighschool.co.uk. So, let's begin by looking at exploration and why it increased. And the first reason we need to look at is expanding trade. Now, the New World, and by this, of course, we mean America being discovered, meant that there was more opportunities for trades now. Now, this was good news because English merchants had been trying to export wool. If you remember, the production of wool really increased during Elizabeth's reign. And the problem is that there was a conflict, if you remember, between the Netherlands and Spain at this time. And so that meant it was very difficult to trade in markets such as Antwerp. They were looking for new places where they could trade and sell this wool. They were also looking for new products to sell as well. And so this meant looking for new markets in other countries. You're not just going to the same places. Well, there were reports from the New World and from the Americas that there was a huge range of different crops. Things like tobacco, sugar, for example. And one example is Spain found a lot of silver in Peru, and that was helping to fund their empire. Now, America at this time was largely undiscovered, and so this encouraged private investors to take the chance, to take the risk. They were often sponsored by people like Elizabeth and her courtiers, and these risky voyages set off to try to find enormous rewards. Now, also during Elizabeth I's reign, we start to see English merchants take part in the horrific African slave trade triangle that you would have studied in Year 8. And English merchants began sailing to West Africa and capturing and selling captured slaves to the New World. So they would be used as slavery for the plantation crops. Now, obviously, this caused huge misfortune to many, and it made huge fortunes to the few who were cruel enough to do this. People like Sir John Hawkins, for example, who, if you remember, helped to stop the Spanish Armada and advised Elizabeth to build galleons. Well, he was an example where he started to buy slaves in 1562. He realised the profit that there was there, and he repeated the voyage in 1564. And essentially, he sets the foundation for the African slave trade triangle that would be copied by thousands over the next few centuries. Another reason is that navigation had become easier. It was becoming more precise. It wasn't so much guesswork anymore. Now, by 1584, Thomas Harriot, an English mathematician, had worked out a simpler way of using the sun to calculate the direction a ship was sailing in. Added to that, you've got quadrants and astrolabes being used more often. Now, these were instruments that used the positions of the stars to calculate a ship's position in the ocean. Their increased use meant that navigation was now simpler and it was more accurate. And this had a consequence because it meant that your long voyages of exploration were now safer, faster, and more direct, making them more appealing to people. Furthermore, journeys were sometimes recorded as well on maps. Now, this made it easier for people to replicate these maps, making navigation even easier, as advice was passed down from journey to journey. Now, like we said, journeys were sometimes recorded, which made it easy for them to be replicated. But also you've got the printing press replicating these maps. They're not just being drawn by hand anymore. And so as a result, you've got maps that are far more detailed and they are far more accurate because it's not just someone copying down what someone else has seen. You're using a press. To add to that, when we're looking at maps, you had the Mercator map developed in 1569 by Gerardus Mercator, very famous map. And this is the first time we start to see lines of longitude and latitude on the maps. And as a result, they were now more accurate when plotting voyages because you had these lines to guide sailors. And like we said, printing helped the maps to be recreated more accurately. Previously, it had been copied by hand, and as you can imagine, this would have led to inaccuracies. But we also need to look at ship design as well, and the fact that galleon ships were starting to be created. Now, galleon ships were large ships, and so as the ships were larger, that meant they could hold more supplies. And this was essential for your long journeys across the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. You want to be able to hold a lot of supplies so that you don't run out. Galleons were also more stable in heavier seas as well, as the bow and stern parts of the ship, as I've shown with the arrows here, were lowered. This meant there was less chance of the ship toppling over in rough seas. You've also got more masts and you've got more sails and different shaped sails as well. You start to see triangular sails being used here. More sails and more masts means that the boat can travel faster, and it's also more manoeuvrable. It will turn more quickly. This means that more sails on the boat means longer, faster and more accurate voyages as a result. You can go out in the sea for longer, you can get to your destination faster, and you can do this with more accuracy. And the final point with galleons, if you remember with the Armada, is that they had cannons running along the length of the ship. And if you look at this picture, basically the square holes down the side show where a cannon would have been. This meant you could fire from the side as well as the bow and stern, which had been used before. Now this makes exploration more enticing because it means that if you do spot an enemy, for example the Spanish, or random pirateers in the ocean, you can actually defend yourself. You have got the weaponry to defend yourself on your voyage. So, in the exam you might get this 12-mark question. Explain why exploration increased under Elizabeth for 12 marks. Before we think about what content we'd bring in, let's remind ourselves of what the examiner would want to see. Your examiner is looking for 3 reasons given, each in their own paragraph. Now, in the exam, you'd be given 2 prompts. You can use both, one, or neither of those prompts. But bringing in a 3rd reason means you will show your own knowledge there. So 3 reasons given. Your examiner is looking in each paragraph for good, relevant detail that shows your historical knowledge. I want to be clear here on the fact that it needs to be relevant. It needs to answer the question. It can't just be random trivia that you're shoehorning in. Each paragraph should answer the question. So here we are explaining clearly why each factor we mention led to an increase in exploration. Although it's not needed, if it was me, I would link back at the end of each paragraph to the question, just to make sure that you've answered it. I would briefly mention how important you think it was and why. This is something you see more in the 16 markers, but I think it's good practice here and it gets you to bring in your own opinion as well. And finally, a conclusion is not needed. Now you might think to yourself, actually, it's just my writing style. I want to bring in a conclusion. I want to have some judgment. If you do that, no more than 2 sentences outlining the main factor and why. Sorry I'm in the way there, but we'll get to model that in a bit later on. Your big conclusions left for the 16 markers. So let's look at the exam content. What would we talk about here? Well, first of all, the fact that you've got increased trade. And here's a model paragraph looking at what we've looked at. You might want to pause the video here to read it. Also the fact you've got easier navigation. Again, here's a model paragraph looking at what we've looked at in the lesson so far. And my 3rd reason would be ship design. And again, a model paragraph here. Now, what would this look like when you bring it all together? Something like this would get you 12 marks. If you pause the video again, look at the detail that I've brought in, look how I've explained, look at the end of each paragraph, how I've linked it back. I've kept a clear focus on the question. I have brought in a conclusion here, but it's not taken me a lot of time at all. It is just 2 sentences. And all I've said at the end is, to conclude, I feel that easier navigation was the main reason for exploration increasing under Elizabeth. Adventurers felt safer and could make more direct journeys, making travel more appealing to them. That's it. That's all I've brought in there straight away. In the exam, writing and planning this down, it should take about 18 to 20 minutes. So let's look at a particular case study then, Drake's circumnavigation of the globe. So Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, which means he went around the world from December 1577 to September 1580. Now, this wasn't his intention when he set out. This wasn't the mission. His mission was basically to raid Spanish colonies in the Pacific Ocean, but the journey just took far longer than he expected. Now, why is this so important? Why do we care about this? Let's look at some factors. First of all, Drake's voyage was an inspiration to other people. The voyage led Drake to being knighted by Elizabeth I on the deck of the Golden Hind. And he also came back with a treasure haul in today's money of about £500 million. And as you can imagine, this inspired other people. They thought, hang on a minute, we can make the same voyage. We could go on these boats. We could rob the Spanish ships as well. Other people were inspired because of Drake to set out on their own explorations or attempt to establish colonies. So the actions of Drake lead to other people copying. Why else is he so important? Well, morale. This was a boost to the morale of English sailors at the time. The voyage could have been a disaster. Only the Golden Hind returned, one of the 5 ships. The rest of them all sunk. One of the captains is killed for mutiny by Drake halfway round. But overall, it was successful. People did come back, and the sailors that did come back came back rich. This leads to a boost in English morale. It showed that actually English ships and English sailors were among the best in the world. They had nothing to fear. Now, this was vital at the time because we were looking at a Spanish invasion. Relations were getting worse at the time between England and Spain. Why else? Well, the information that was gathered. Drake was able to gather information on South America. He attacked many Spanish ships there. So he was able to draw up maps, write down logs, and share them with other English sailors to encourage them to explore. Drake was saying, here's my knowledge, now build on this. Go on your own voyages and build on this straight away. And English sailors did. Also the fact with Nova Albion. So on the voyage, the Golden Hind landed in modern-day San Francisco in June 1579, and the ship needed urgent repairs. It needed to dock. And where they landed were Native Americans, and they were welcoming of the English, and they performed a ceremony for the travellers. And Drake basically interpreted the ceremony as a coronation. And he said, okay, well, you want us here, you want us to be your rulers, a bit presumptuous. He said, this area is called Nova Albion. Elizabeth I is the sovereign. She is the ruler of this area. Now, why is that such a big deal? Well, first of all, this peaceful welcome showed that the Europeans could settle and live there. This would help provide inspiration for future colonization that you've looked at, for example, in Virginia. And as you can imagine, there was no consideration shown to natives' rights to the lands. The English basically thought, we'll just live here instead. But a final reason why we could see this event as important as circumnavigation is because of the damage to Anglo-Spanish relations, England and Spain. Now, Spain believed they and the Portuguese had exclusive rights to the New World, exclusive rights to the Americas. It was to do with no other country at all. Now, this was because the Pope had declared this almost a century before. And Drake's actions attacking the Spanish colonies in the New World angered Spain, as you can imagine. And it added to the increased tension that we were seeing at the time between England and Spain. Now, Elizabeth adds this tension by publicly knighting Drake on the deck of the Golden Hind. This sent a clear message to Spain that the English have attacked Spain, they have stolen from Spain, they have effectively trespassed in the New World, and Elizabeth was pleased. Elizabeth was rewarding this at the time. So, if you were to get this as a 12 marker in the exam, explain why Drake's circumnavigation of the globe was so important, have a think, what could we talk about here? Just pause the video to have a write down some ideas. So you might mention the following. You could mention the fact that it encouraged exploration from others because they saw how rich he was and the journeys were logged and passed down. The impact on English-Spanish relationships at the time, and the fact Nova Albion was taken and named after Elizabeth, showing that England could have claim to some parts of America. But let's look at this 16-mark question then. Drake's most significant achievement in the years 1558 to 1588 was the circumnavigation of the globe. How far do you agree? 16 marks. Well, we've clearly just looked at this and seen actually this was a significant achievement. But was it the most important thing Drake did? Have a think. What else does Drake do during this time period? Pause the video to make some notes and then press play to continue. Okay, so we could have mentioned the privateering, the fact that Drake ended up with thousands of pounds worth of Spanish gold when he was doing his privateering work in the 70s, and that led to him being employed by Elizabeth. We could mention the raid on Cadiz, the singeing of the king's beard. when Drake saw the Armada ships, sailed into Cadiz, set fire to about 30 of them, and as a result, the Armada was delayed by a year. Or the fact that Drake was one of the people in charge of the Armada and organised a fireship tactic with Thomas Howard that helped stop the Armada attack and protect England. So let's think about how we'd lay this down in the exam for a 16-mark question. The first thing you want to do is to plan a table like this, where people might agree and disagree with the statements. So for agree, he inspired other people to copy his voyages. The circumnavigation of the globe led to other people copying and led to further English sailors taking to the ocean. The fact that he made a huge amount of money as well can be seen as a significant achievement. He became very rich from this. He gained land in America for Elizabeth with Nova Albion. And the fact he was knighted publicly as well. Clearly, the circumnavigation of the globe was a significant achievement for Drake. But it doesn't mean it was the most significant thing that he did during his time period. As we've seen, you might say, hang on a minute, I think it was the privateering, it was the work he started to do, where he got the attention of Elizabeth, where he was hired by Elizabeth, where he made a huge amount of money. You might say, actually, I think it was the raid on Cadiz. It was the fact that he spotted the Armada ships and set fire to them. He helped protect his country. Or you might say, actually, I think it was his actions during the Armada itself. The fact that he helped fight for England, he helped organise the fireships and deploy them as a tactic alongside Thomas Howard. So in the 16-mark question, you would want to look at both the agree side and write down why people might agree. And you'd also want to look at the disagree side as well. I would mention the agree argument first of all, and then I would mention a disagree argument afterwards. Maybe pick 2 or 3 from that list and write them out in full. Think about why people might agree with the point of view, why they might disagree, and make sure you say what you think as well. And we'll look at 16-mark questions in detail in another video. So, hopefully this has been useful. Please, please, please add this to your revision material. Make some flashcards. If you want to practice any of those exam questions and send them over, I'm happy to mark them. And as always, thank you very much for your hard work, guys. Take care.